We are honored to have a presentation on the characterization of particle and chemical emissions from 3D printers. We understand this topic is very near and dear to the hearts of several people, and especially some in our schools community. And I'd like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Marilyn Black, who is the Vice President and Senior Technical Advisor at Underwriters Laboratory. She is the founder of Air Quality Sciences Incorporating, a leading testing and research organization focused on chemical and biological air pollutants. Dr. Black also founded the Green Guard Certification Program, a third-party indoor air quality certification program for building materials, electronics, and furnishings. And our second speaker is Dr. Rodney Weber. Dr. Weber is a professor in the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Georgia Institute of Technology. His research focuses on studying the sources, atmospheric processing, and environmental health and health impacts of ambient aerosol particles. Dr. Black and Dr. Weber, thank you so much for doing this, and I'll hand it to you. Before I do, let me say that questions can be put into the chat box on the in the web system, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Thank you, Dr. Black and Dr. Weber.
Okay, this is Rodney Weber. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to give the first part of this talk, and then Marilyn Black will come in near the end. So let me say first that Georgia Tech was contracted. We had a contract with Underwriting Laboratories with Maryland to do this research, so they funded our work. Our work focused mainly on the aerosol emissions from 3D printers. So that's what I will talk about, and a bit of the VOC emissions also. And Marilyn will talk about the setting of a voluntary standard. I should point out that much of this work was done by a PhD student, Chan Zhang, the second author here. And this made up her PhD dissertation. She has since graduated. So let's get into it. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so additive manufacturing includes a broad range of methods for in 3D printing. And as these numbers show at the top here, 4 billion globally in 2014, increasing by an order of magnitude in 2025, there's significant interest in this process. So there's many ways to, or many methods for additive manufacturing. I'm going to focus, right now our testing focused on consumer 3D printers. And these are generally extrusion-based, sometimes called fused deposition modeling, or FDM, or more recently it's called fused filament fabrication 3D printing. These tend to be smaller and are available to consumers, and we're not looking at industrial type 3D printers here. So the general idea is that you have a spool of the plastic, the thermoplastic filament. It comes in a wire. It's about a couple millimeters diameter. It's fed through a heated die, which melts the plastic, and then the object is built layer by layer on a three-dimensional actuated platform. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, these are quite popular now in a variety of locations because they tend to be small, affordable, a couple $1,000s typically, easy to operate, and they've been marketed to consumers. They're widely used in schools, all the way from grade schools up to universities. Georgia Tech here has a engineering lab where there's about 30 of the printers in one room that students build various objects in what they call an invention studio. They're found in offices, residences, and libraries. It's a rather daunting task to try to figure out the emissions from these printers because there's so many permeations and combinations of printer manufacturers and types of filaments that can be used. Just the filaments alone makes it very complicated, so we are going to focus here on mainly 3 filaments, actually mainly 2, ABS and PLA, which are quite common. We did a little bit of studies on nylon, but there's many more types of filaments that are being produced continually with various additives to these kind of base materials, which makes trying to understand the emissions from these printers complicated. Next slide. Okay, so our overall research objective was to characterize and quantify the particle and chemical, or VOC, emissions from FFF 3D printers. What are the levels of the emissions? And for the particles, there's the added complication of we have particle size and particle chemical composition. What are the factors that control the emissions from these printers? We did a little bit of preliminary work on what is the toxicity of the particle emissions and VOCs. And another goal was to establish a reproducible testing method so we could compare between studies and have a consistency in assessing exposure to these printers in various environments. And then to develop a consensus standard testing method and maybe a way to a criteria to assess various printers and filaments. Next slide. Okay, so we needed a standard method because of measuring these, or a standard experimental approach to measure these emissions. Because when we started this work a couple years ago, there had already been a couple of papers published on emissions from these consumer 3D printers by a number of investigators around the world, and the issue was that people tend to use the instruments, the methods, the rooms available to do these tests, and so it was hard to compare between various emission results, or the results of their emissions. And if you want to do a good exposure analysis, you need a very standardized way to assess what the emissions are from these printers. So what we did is we followed the already existing method that was developed for laser printer emissions. And that is, this method is published, and it's the Blue Angel method. Next slide. Okay, so here are the measurements and the basic approach. I'll talk about each of these individually in more detail. So the general idea of this Blue Angel method is you have a 1 cubic meter chamber. The printer is located inside the chamber, and the chamber is sealed, except that you have an air intake where you push air into the chamber at a flow rate of 16.7 liters per minute. That gives you an air exchange rate of 1 cubic meter per hour. So you have 1 exchange rate of the chamber per hour. The air is room air that has been stripped of all particles as best as possible in VOCs. The chamber is well mixed. We control the printer externally. We start it externally. We have instruments that can sample from the air within the chamber. So in the red box are online instruments that measure continuously. An SMPS is a scanning mobility particle sizer, optical particle counter, condensation particle counter. The ACSM and AMS are mass spectrometers we use to measure online. I'm mainly going to talk about particle number emissions from these, from the aerosol component, but we'll talk a little bit about composition too. We had absorption tubes to collect VOCs and aldehydes for off-line analysis. We collected particles in some experiments on filters. We did an offline pyro-GCMS analysis. I'll talk a bit about that, and a little bit of particle toxicity. The test procedure follows the Blue Angel method, and that can be found on the web. Next slide. This is a picture of the chamber. The black box on the left-hand side is a 1 cubic meter chamber. The instruments on the table are the online aerosol instruments that measure the number concentration. On the top of the box, you can see the 1 meter cube chamber is a flow controller for the permeation, the the absorption tubes for the VOC analysis. Lower left picture is a printer sitting on a metal table inside this chamber. The inside is made of stainless steel, so it's very reflective. And you can see the tubes, the Teflon tubes coming down the top for the VOC analysis. You can't see the tubes sticking in the side. Well, maybe that's the reflection on the other side. There's tubes for the aerosol measurements. Next slide. Okay, so how we interpret the data and the numbers that we produce from these experiments is described here. So this follows the analysis that has been done for laser printers. So this is a picture, a graph taken out of that publication, the BAM for laser printer method. So this shows a measurement of particle concentration, that's particles per centimeter cubed of air on the vertical axis, versus time on the horizontal axis, and the blue highlighted shaded area is when the printer is actually printing. So you can see at the beginning, note that the vertical axis is a log scale. The printer starts off with very few particles in the chamber, and then the particle concentrations rise. The printing finishes, and the concentrations start to drop off, mainly because the chamber is continually being diluted with clean particle-free air. So that is actually an exponential decay, since this is a semi-log plot. So you can calculate things like the rate, the particle emission rate, from various, picking off data from this type of a measurement or graph, and that's the particles emitted at a given time, per time, the emission rate, or you can integrate over the measurement and come up with a total particle number emitted for a given printed run. That's TP. And these are the calculations that are done based on the laser printer method. Beta is you can account for wall losses, the possible losses of particles to the walls of the chamber. That's the beta parameter in these equations, and that's determined during the period when the particles are being flushed out of the chamber over time, the exponential decay when the instrument is off. You can do similar calculations of particle emission rates and total particle numbers emitted for surface area and mass emissions if interested. And there's a similar process for the emissions of VOC. Next slide. Okay, so in this talk today specifically, here's how I'm going to go through this. We're going to talk about particle and VOC emissions. I'm going to focus largely on the particle emissions. We did size resolved measurements of particle emissions. Our approach was to do a systematic as possible evaluation of parameters that affect the, what we think affect the number of particles emitted, such as the type of printer, the manufacturer of the printer, the manufacturer of the filament or the plastic used in the printer, the filament material itself, the color of the filament, and there were a couple of other things we also looked at, like plate temperature and things like that, which I won't go into. We did an analysis of the chemical composition of the particles. We developed a model to try to understand the processes that produce the observations of the particle concentrations we saw in the chamber, see if our thinking was right. And we did a preliminary analysis of the toxicity of the aerosol. We did VOC emissions, and then I'll give you a little bit of a summary. And then Marilyn will talk about part 2, the standards. So next slide. Okay, so for calculating the particle or measuring the particle emissions from these printers. So again, we took room air that had a low relative, we dried the air out, so the relative humidity was low. It was at room temperature. We removed the particles in the room air by HEPA filter, had VOC denuders, 1 air exchange rate per hour. We sampled with 3 particle instruments. The instrument in the middle, the 3022, just measures the total number of particles larger than 7 nanometers in diameter. We had an SMPS that's a scanning mobility particle spectrometer that measures the size distributions of the number concentrations of particles between 7 nanometers and 300 nanometers. And then to get larger particles, we had an optical particle counter, the instrument on the far right, the TSI AeroTrack, which measured from 300 nanometers or zero point 0.3 microns to 25 microns. So we could span a very broad size range, and we had another measurement to measure just the total number that was not size resolved. And these measurements were made continuously during the printing and after the printing stopped, and the data were collected, I think, at about a rate of 1 per minute. Next slide, average per minute. So this is the kind of result you get when you make these measurements and you have a printer in the chamber. Looking at the left-hand side graph first, the red line and the red axis on the left is the number concentration, number of particles per centimeter cubed per air. The blue and the blue scale and the green scale are inferred surface area concentrations and mass concentrations of the particles. These are calculated from the measured number distributions where we assume the particles are spherical and they have a density of 1. Those are assumptions. So those are estimated surface area and mass concentrations. What you see there is kind of typical of a measurement of the emissions of particles in a chamber like this. There's practically 0 concentrations to begin with because we filtered the air. Now this is a linear scale, by the way, on the vertical axis. There's a very sudden jump to very high number concentrations. The red line reaches a peak. And in this case, when we only were printing an object that took an hour to print, the concentrations after the peak was reached dropped off. But you can see the surface and the mass kind of stayed steady. They jumped up originally, then they fluctuated, and they dropped off when the printing stopped. Now, we found that you really should print longer than about an hour, or else your measurements are dominated by that first peak that you see when you first start printing. And the second graph on the right shows focusing on the red line, the number concentration. You can see that we printed this object that took about 7 hours to print. And you see again the very large increase in particles at the beginning. When you start printing, it drops. But if you let it keep printing, you reach kind of a steady state value, and things just go on. The particle concentrations in the chamber stayed fairly steady. Then when you stop, then you have the exponential decay as the clean air slowly flushes out the chamber. This peak in the beginning looks a lot like these particles are forming from the vapors themselves, so new particle formation by homogeneous nucleation. Next slide. I'll talk about that in a bit more later. This shows, so the previous slide showed the number concentration. This shows the size distribution of the aerosol. So the top graph on the left is the number distribution, that is the concentration particle by number as a function of particle diameter for different times during the print period. And the middle graph and the bottom graph are the surface area and the mass. So you can see at the top graph, that's when print is starting. You have smaller particles that are maybe on the order of the peak is around between 30 and 40 nanometers diameter. As the printing continues over time, the particles grow to larger sizes, and the distribution slowly shifts to the larger sizes, and the concentration slightly drops. The concentration would be, you can see it as the area under the curve. The contour graph with the colors in it to the right are a different way of presenting the evolution of the size of the aerosol during printing. And the vertical axis is the diameter of the particles, going from about 7 nanometers, which is our lower detection limit, up to about 200 nanometers. And you can see when you start printing, you have the particles, the time is on the horizontal axis, and the color is the concentration. So you can see you have this kind of, in the ambient atmosphere, they call this a banana shape, because it kind of looks like a banana, I guess. The idea is that you have nucleated particles when you start printing from gases forming new particles. Those particles then grow and coagulate, and that's what causes the evolution of the distribution over time. Next slide. Now this shows some printers that had different arrangements, and it demonstrates that not all printers behave the same way in their emissions of particles. So on the left, we have a printer that had two fans near that extruder nozzle, the heated nozzle. And you can see that they don't look very much like what we had in the previous graphs. And this really just demonstrates that in general, what we found is we had to run the printers for a longer period of time, so we had a good average measurement of the emissions, and that you can only get so much information, I think you could say, from the actual evolution. So maybe looking at the total concentration overall is a good metric to think about. The other slide on the right shows that, and I'm going to talk about this more later, this is two different forms of PLA. One had an additive in the PLA that was to make it less brittle, and that what had resulted in a significantly different emission. You can just barely see the blue line when plotted on a linear vertical axis. So measured number, concentrations, emissions can substantially vary during the printing process, and you have to run the printer for a sufficient time to get a characteristic average emission. Next slide. Okay, so the way we chose to characterize the emissions from a printer is to normalize by the mass of the object printed. So for example, this is a graph on, let's start on the right-hand side graph here. We call this the yield, which is the slope of the line in this case of the total number of emissions. So each dot on that graph is an experiment where we printed an object that took a different period of time, or it produced the object with a different mass that was being printed, or it consumed a different mass of filament in the printing process. So the idea is, and this was printing different shapes on the same printer with the same filament. And the idea is that if you take the slope of that line, that gives you a characteristic emission for that arrangement. It doesn't depend on the mass of the object, the shape of the object you're printing. It gives you a number, the yield, which is the total emission per mass of object you print. Another way to do that would be to do it by normalized by time. And this graph on the left shows that there's a linear relationship basically between print time and mass of the object. Bigger objects you're printing take more time to print. So you could normalize by mass or time. We chose to normalize by mass. So from everything else I show now, I'm going to talk about the total number concentration, and that's what generally we'll talk about, of the particles emitted for one print time per mass of the object printed, or the mass of the filament consumed. Next slide. So we did a whole series of tests. We looked at filament color, the filament brand. What I mean by brand is the manufacturer, the printer brand, the filament material, ABS versus PLA, nylon, etc. And we also look specifically at adjusting the nozzle temperature, the temperature you heat the plastic in the printer. Most printers, you can't really adjust that, but some you can. So we did about 64 runs, separate printer runs for ABS filament, 67 for PLA, and we did only a minor number of experiments for nylon. The table shows the various combinations of what we did. So we had three printers, A, B, and C brands. We looked at ABS, nylon, PLA, and we had different filament brands from A through E. And we looked at, so for example, the first row in this table would be we had printer A running ABS, filament brand B, and we looked at yellow, blue, green, red, white to see if there's effect of color on the emissions. Then we compare, for example, if you go down on the table, we have printer about 3/4 of the way down. There's printer C. So that's a different printer with a different brand, but we also had I guess you should go to the second line, printer brand A with ABS, capital A, with a different filament. So we tried to isolate each component of these variables and try to figure out what mattered. We did similar analysis for VOCs, but we didn't run as many VOCs experiments because this was an offline analysis and it was much more laborious and we couldn't do as many tests with it. Next slide. Okay, so here is some of the results. This is the number yield. So this is let's look at the slide on the left, the graph on the left. This is the total number of particles emitted for a given print versus massive object printed. And this summarizes the statistics. The bottom of these bar whisker graphs are for PLA. Then N in the bracket, the number in the bracket below is the number of experiments, the number of data in each bar whisker. So we have PLA, ABS, nylon, and then the other PLA, other ABS, and other materials are from other published papers that we, even though they did the experiments probably slightly different, we included their data in this graph. So essentially what you see on the first graph is that ABS, and the vertical axis is a log scale, produces a lot more particles than PLA by about 2 orders of magnitude or so. Nylon is closer to ABS, but somewhere between those two, but lower than ABS, higher than PLA. If you look at the average diameter of the particle produced at these various filaments, same type of graph on the right, but diameter now. So PLA, even though it produces less number, the particles are smaller. The horizontal line at 100 nanometers kind of delineates what people talk about as nanoparticles being less than 0.1 microns or 100 nanometers. So all of these printers, except for nylon, tend to be producing largely nanoparticles. So PLA is the smallest particles on average. ABS is a little bit bigger. Nylon produces larger particles, somewhere in the order of 120 nanometers in diameter on average, and then the results from the other experiments are similar. Next slide. Okay, so this shows now the average particle emission rate, not the total number that was emitted, but the rate. And here we can compare these measurements from these printers tested to laser printers. Since we're following that method and there's an established standard for this, you can see the laser printers tend to have an emission rate of particles that is maybe slightly higher than these printers. But you have to keep in mind that the 3D printers can run for much longer periods of time, and this is just showing the rate at which the particles are emitted during the process. To get the total number, you would have to integrate that rate over the time you print. But the rate of emissions are very similar. The maximum number concentration for the graph shown on the right are also pretty similar between these 3D printers we tested and the laser printers, except for PLA tends to be at the lower end of that by an order of magnitude or so. Next slide. Okay, so one of the things we wanted to test was, since this seems to be a process in which the vapors are being emitted by the heated filament that then condense and form aerosols, we wanted to see what the effect of temperature of the nozzle was. So we had a printer that allowed us to change the temperature. So for a given filament and a given object shape, we could just change the one variable of the temperature. And looking at the black line here, the red line is the mass yield. But let's just look at the number yield for the graph on the left. It looks pretty exponential. As you increase the temperature of the filament, you get a higher number of particles. And this would make sense if it's a process of the vapors being emitted then being converted to aerosols. With higher temperatures, you emit more vapors. This graph on the right is a bit more complicated. Basically, it shows again the line with the data points show changing the temperature for a given printer and filament type, and then the bar graphs show the set temperatures for various printers, and so you generally, and various materials. So you can generally see that ABS tends to, the printers that have higher set temperatures, which include those printers that run ABS, they produce more aerosols. When you get down to PLA, their set temperatures are generally lower, and they produce lower aerosol emissions. Next slide. Now, one of the things we found that was intriguing was that you can buy filaments from the same type of filament. So this shows, I'm trying to compare here, but well, basically, let me back up. The filaments, as I've been kind of pointing out, are the major variable that determines the number yield, because these filaments are run at very different temperatures, and they also have different additives possibly. So, for example, this graph shows, again, what we've seen before. ABS or PLA has the lowest number yield of particles. Nylon is somewhat comparable to ABS, maybe a bit lower in some cases. But here we've broken out the ABS in two different boxes. So those are these two boxes to the left on the graph. We found that some filaments that we just bought filaments at random on Amazon.com, and some of the filaments, even though they were ABS, could have much higher emissions than some other ABS filaments, just from a different manufacturer. And so we called these super emitters, and they were about an order of magnitude higher emitters, produced more particles than our regular ABS filaments. Next slide. Okay, so the general idea, conceptual idea of what was happening here is that the filament is heated, it produces vapors. When you start off running these printers, and there's very few pre-existing particles in the chamber because the chamber was cleaned, but this is true actually. We did tests on if you were running the printer with just room air. There's so few particles in the air and room air that the vapors can really build up in concentration near the object you're printing. They homogeneously nucleate and form new, very small particles that produces that very large peak at the beginning of when we saw the time evolution of the concentration of the chamber. Once you have a lot of particles formed sitting around the extrusion region, now some of the vapors can condense on the particles you've just made, and these particles can also coagulate because they're fairly concentrated in a small area, and that can explain the evolution of the size distribution. So the idea is that semi-volatile compounds, we don't know what those compounds are, emitted near the extruder nozzle, and their emission is a function of temperature, is what produces the vapors that nucleate to form new particles. They condense. They also condense some pre-existing particles, and the particles interact with each other and coagulate. And then there's also dispersion in the chamber and wall losses, and this could be explaining what we have observed. So to assess this, we developed a dynamic model to try to see if we could simulate the process. Okay, so basically, we have a problem in developing a model to explain the process of aerosol formation and evolution in the chamber because we don't know the properties of the condensing vapor. So what we did is this was done by Pratim Biswas, by the way, in collaboration with him at Washington University in St. Louis. You put a small control volume right near the nozzle that includes the newly laid down plastic material, and you consider the vapor generation, nucleation of new particles, coagulation, and condensation within this control volume. Now, since the properties of nucleating vapors weren't known, we did a sensitivity analysis instead of trying to track the evolution in the chamber itself, and we wanted to see if these processes could explain the steady state concentrations that we saw in a couple of experiments. So we looked at a couple of different ABS and nylon materials, filaments, and we used the steady state data as the input to the model, and we looked at some key parameters: vapor emission rates, the vapor saturation, vapor pressure, and the vapor condensation factor, which describes how the vapor goes onto the pre-existing aerosol. Next slide. The key results essentially of this is that the particle formation and growth processes we observed in the chamber could really be explained by this nucleation condensation process, that the vapors were driving this, and that these processes really determined the steady state particle concentration and the size of the particles, and that all this processing really happened just in the vicinity of the nozzle in a fairly small area right near where the particles are, right where the plastic is being laid down. We found that the saturation vapor pressures of the species that were driving this were somewhere in the range of 10 to the minus 3 or 10 to the minus 1 pascals. We don't know what the vapor is, but a key variable is the vapor emission rate. And this is consistent with what we saw in our analysis that the nozzle temperature really tends to be a key factor in controlling the number of emissions. And different filaments have different ranges in which you operate the nozzle temperature at. It also kind of suggested that you could possibly design a way to remove these particles while they're very small and highly mobile, if you put a collection device right near the place where the particles are being formed through a thermophoretic type effect. If you could put maybe a cool plate nearby, it would maybe absorb some of these newly formed particles. But that's just an hypothesis. That would take more work to look into. Next slide. Okay, so what is the chemical composition of these particles? So now looking at we didn't do many analyses, but we tried to find some evidence for what the composition was. We did a limited number of experiments. So we did the online analysis with mass spectrometers and AMS and ACSM. And we did the offline analysis on a filter. So the online analysis has the advantage that you can look at the particles without collecting them. So you're drawing the particles right into the instrument from the chamber. Yeah, but the problem with that is you can't measure the composition of the filament itself. Whereas when the Pyro GCMS analysis, we could collect particles on filters and we could compare the composition directly of the particle filter composition to the filament composition. Next slide. We only did the Pyro GCMS on ABS. Okay, so this slide shows the online measurements with the aerosol mass spectrometer, or we either use an AMS or a smaller version, the ACSM. This shows the mass spectra. So it's just basically the fraction of the total signal from these mass spectra versus mass to charge. So looking on the left slide for ABS, the green is the mass spectra we observe from the particles, and the other colors, the blue, the red, and the black on the left side, are what we got for the monomers that make up the ABS would look like based on reference spectral libraries. So we have acrylonitrile, butadiene, and styrene as what we think might be the monomers involved in ABS. And you can see that the green, the actual aerosol, is not really similar to the monomers. Now PLA, in contrast, we have lactic acid and lactide as monomers, and the green is the actual aerosol composition. And so it looks like there's more of a agreement between the PLA and the actual filament material. So it looks like PLA aerosol, even though a lot less is produced than ABS, there's a lot less number of particles, that looks like it's more related to the actual monomer material, where ABS looks very different. Next slide. So we analyzed next slide, please. We analyzed the ABS by the pyrolysis GCMS system, which could compare the filament and the particles directly, and we found that the ABS-generated particles had a different composition than the filament. So basically, overall, what we find is that in some cases, such as ABS, the particles that are formed are driven by some unknown minor component of the filament, probably an additive that the manufacturer of the filament doesn't have to report. And this explains why we get some filaments like ABS that are super emitters and some that are more similar to the rest of the or more general ABS filaments, because there is some unknown additive in that filament that we don't know of that's driving much of the particle formation process, or it's producing a vapor that condenses and forms the particles. So this means that the consumer has little insight on what emission levels to expect when selecting filaments from various vendors, because you don't really know what additives are in the filaments and how efficient they are producing particles. Next slide. Okay, so we did a very preliminary analysis of toxicity just to see what kind of results we would get, and this was done with some collaborators at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. We sent them some samples. So we did various tests kind of associated with the oxidative stress mechanism. We did some biological assessments in vivo or intracheal mice exposures. We did 3 in vitro cellular assays using either a rat alveolar macrophage or human lung epithelial cells. In all the cases of the biological assessments, the particles did induce some kind of toxic response in the assays above a background filter blank. But that doesn't mean how toxic they are. But one thing, we don't have exact mimicking exposure in the or what the concentrations they would be inhaled at. But one thing we did find is that PLA emitted particles had a similar toxic response, but at significantly lower doses than the ABS. And so we also did a cell-free assay, the diethyltretol assay, which was easier to do, and so we could do more replicates and try different things. The DTT assay, if you look at the toxicity as determined by the DTT activity, that's the measured, I won't go into the details of the assay, but the rate at which DTT is consumed in this assay per mass of the particle, PLA stands out as being the most toxic. Now, there's a caveat here, is because we were not able to do these experiments on the first go around with similar mass exposures. The PLA masses were lower than the ABS masses in these experiments because the PLA produces so few particles relative to ABS. We had a problem collecting, doing the experiments at similar, but we're trying at similar masses, but we're working on that. But the take-home message really is that it's really not the toxicity of the particles that matters. It's basically how much you're exposed to. So if you convert the toxicity based on these assays response per mass of the particle, and you count for the amount of particle mass that is emitted by the filament to give the response of the assay, like the DTT per mass of print object, or the length of time you print, then because the ABS is emitting so many more particles than PLA, for example, they are significantly more, they would look significantly more toxic by these experiments. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Let's talk about the VOCs briefly. So the VOCs, we had 2 sample collection systems, absorption tubes for collecting VOCs, a 10x tube for VOCs that were speciated by GCMS, and we did total VOCs on that also, and a DNPH tube for looking at aldehydes that were analyzed by HPLC. Next slide. Now, first of all, one could ask the question of how do the emissions of the VOCs compare with the emissions of particles? So if you look at a given evolution during the print period, they actually don't look a lot alike, but there's a lot of variability, recall, in the particle emissions. And remember, again, the VOC emissions, we don't have a continuous measurement. We have to do this manually, so we don't have much data on this. But there is some variability in the concentration as a function of time that one would be exposed to during a print process between particles and VOCs. That's what these 2 graphs show. But now if you back out and think about, let's just compare different printers or different filament materials and look at total VOC emissions for a print run or total particle emissions for a print run, there is some kind of weak relationship. So different printers and filaments produce particle and VOC emissions. Generally, they generally increase together. They have a Spearman rank correlation of greater than 0.58. So in other words, for particle mass or number versus the total VOCs emitted. So the filaments, for example, that produce the most aerosols generally also produce the most VOCs in general, the VOCs, the T VOCs that we can measure, but it's not a linear correlation. But when you look at specific VOCs to particle emissions, then there's really no correlation at all. You have to basically think of them. If you wanted to do the complete analysis of exposure, you have to measure the particles and the VOC emissions. Next slide. Okay, so this shows, I'm going to focus on the pie charts here. This shows the fraction of what was measured for a specific filament of specific VOCs. So starting at the left with ABS, the S in ABS is styrene, and so styrene was one of the major VOCs measured that comes off of a printer with an ABS filament. And there's a bunch of other compounds, such as benzaldehyde, ethylbenzene, vinyl-cyclohexene, and formaldehyde is fairly significant too. PLA, on the other hand, produces a significant amount of lactide, which is probably since it's polylactic acid, coming from the filament, the lactic acid components, and this acetaldehyde. And a big component is butanol and methyl-methylacrylate. And for nylon, the big major component emitted of the VOCs that were measured was caprolactam. I guess we should go to the next slide. Now, if you look at the top graph shows emission rates, and the other bottom part graph shows the yield. So that's just like for the particles, that's the mass of the VOC emitted per mass of filament printed, mass of filament consumed, or object mass printed. So if you look at the pink for just ABS, the total VOCs, of course, are quite high. Styrene is going to be higher than the other speciated VOCs. Styrene is a major component, and you can see the other components. And if you compare the pink to the blue, you can see that ABS emits much more in TVOCs than ABS. And nylon we have much less data on, so we don't have much statistics, but its emissions are largely are somewhat similar to ABS, and it's mostly all caprolactam that's being emitted. Okay, so there is some similarity in a general sense when you stand back and look at the particle emissions. Next slide. So this kind of summarizes some of possible health implications that could be associated with some exposure to some of these specific VOCs, such as styrene is a probable carcinogen, and odor and eye irritant affects the respiratory, reproductive development, nervous system. I'm not going to go through this all here. You can see these are the major components, some of the major components that we measured. For nylon, caprolactam is an eye and skin irritant and affects the respiratory and cardiovascular and nervous system. And next slide. Okay, so this, I think, is my final slide that summarizes everything I've said so far. What we have found is that 3D printers, these consumer 3D printers that are generally sold to the general population, they can emit significant levels of ultrafine or nanoparticles, particles smaller than 100 nanometers, non-engineered nanoparticles. And their emission rates are similar or slightly less to laser printers, which have been studied extensively before. Keep in mind, as I said, these printers may run for much longer periods of time than a printer in a typical office or home setting. Emission levels vary with specific printer and print material. The filament is the type of filament you use is a major variable. And a lot of this is controlled by the nozzle, the temperature of the nozzle, and the brand of the filament that you buy. The chemical composition of the particles can differ from the filament polymer. For some ABS filaments, and the emissions may be largely driven by what we think are minor additives. We would need to do more chemical testing on this. We haven't looked at metals, for example. Their implication, I think, is that the consumer is somewhat uninformed. But there is a general thing that we found that ABS emits more particles than nylon, and nylon and ABS emit much more than PLA. But you can have combinations, you can have additives in these both. We've seen this in PLA and ABS that can significantly change or increase the overall emissions. So it's hard to say making a general statement to say how much a given filament will emit. And this means there's going to have to be substantial testing of all the various filaments if you really want to know what's going on. In vitro and in vivo and acellular assays show that they can be toxic, but this is just preliminary work. There's much more that needs to be done on that. 3D printers emit VOCs along with particles, and that generally is a similar process and trend. The VOCs that we think were of concern are formaldehyde and caprolactam and styrene. The effects of combined exposure to emitted particles in VOCs should also be studied, since a person is being exposed to these simultaneously. The users of 3D printers should probably reduce their exposures as much as possible, given these known now emissions that come from these printers. Next slide. There are papers published on what I've presented. The first top paper is also, these two published papers are shown on the bottom here. They are open access, so you can download them from the website. They're published in the journal Aerosol Science and Technology. The first paper is probably the most interest to the general public in that it's on the aerosol number emissions. The second paper is on the modeling study. And then we are working on two more publications, one on the chemical composition and the preliminary toxicity work. And then there's another paper we're working on, the VOC emissions. Next slide. And that's all of my part of the presentation. I think Marilyn will now talk about the standard.
Well, thank you, Rodney. I'll pick it up from here, and thank you to all of you participants that are hanging in there with us. If I could go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about the standard development process that we began after getting into this research, and part of our objective was to make sure that we had key stakeholders involved, not only in the research, but reviewing the results and helping us determine the pathway forward. And after we had a good bit of the research done in data, we brought all of the stakeholders together for a one-day meeting, and this included the manufacturers of printers, filaments, chemical companies, consumers, researchers, health folks, and let them see the data, see what we were finding. And coming out of that particular initiative, the general stakeholder consensus was that it would be good to continue into developing an actual standard that would allow for consistent testing and assessment of these emissions from 3D printers. And so their objectives really were nothing more than that, but to establish a standard that would definitively give the information on how to test and measure consistently, and a way to assess what that data means in an effort to try to minimize the hazardous emissions that we may be getting in the marketplace. And so a standard panel was put together in November 2017 following a ANSI process. This ultimately became an ANSI Canadian standard operated through UL's ANSI consensus process, and is now known as ANSI CAN UL 2904. The standard was completed in December and officially published in January of this year. And as far as we know, it's the first global 3D print standard for minimizing hazardous indoor air emissions. There is a EU work group who is focused on this, but they are giving more guidance on what to do other than developing actual standards. If I could have the next slide. So our standard overview basically is, number one, the largest part of it is having it defines a test method. How you use an environmental chamber, how you set that up, how you manage your printer, how you do your particle measurements, your VOC aldehyde measurements, how you take your data measurements, your particle emissions, and analyze those, and VOC emissions. And then the standard also lists comparative criteria that would allow one to make a definition for the particular printer filament combination. Next slide. So the standard test method that covers basically a 3-day testing period that incorporates cleaning and verifying your environmental chamber, verifying the operability of your 3D printer and the feedstock, and conditioning those, getting them in the chamber, and then operating them in the chamber. And after collecting your various background samples, printing an object for a defined 4-hour period, and collecting your particle and chemical samples for analysis. All of that is detailed out in the 2904 standard. Next slide. So the standard also details out how you do your data analysis on your particle collections through your particle size distribution and counts, how you do your calculations for particle emission rate, total particles, and also your particle loss coefficient in the chamber. It gives you details on collecting your individual VOCs, how to calculate TVOC, and determine your emission rates for all of those, and then information on how to conduct actual exposure modeling to get a building concentration number. Next slide. So when we wanted to actually set criteria so that we would have a criteria to enable manufacturers and users to assess and compare different printers and different systems. VOCs were somewhat easier because we do have criteria for VOC levels overall, but for the ultrafine particle criteria, we don't have a standard in the marketplace currently to use. And so we came up with a recommended performance-based criteria that was based on our research data, where we took all of the data that we had on the particle measurements and basically followed a similar approach that had been done for ultrafine particles for the laser printer standard by Blue Angel. So we took all of the data and statistically looked at that, and then we set a criteria at the 80th percentile, which meant that the criteria would be based on the 80th percentile. So products that were tested and exhibited a number greater than what was found, greater than what the 80th percentile would be, then that would exceed the particular criteria. And in this case, the particle yield criteria, or particle emission rate, was 3 × 10⁻11 particles per hour. Next slide. On the VOCs, we took basically the criteria that was currently in the marketplace being used for indoor air programs. And the model that was used was a single-room model. The model was taken from California's 1350 document, their standard practice for assessing VOCs for use in buildings. And in that particular document, they have single-room models for an office, a school classroom, and also recommendation for residential home. And for this particular standard, we set the criteria for the office to be the default model to be used if you were comparing products against each other in a verification program or just wanted comparative data. And then for the VOC criteria, we took the 3 main programs that were being used in the indoor air programs, the ACGH TLVs, and we assigned a 1/10 protection factor to that. We took the California chronic reference exposure levels and took 1/2 of that value. And then we took the EU, the AGBB program, which has a list of chemicals of concern and recommended criteria. So we used those 3 as the criteria. If a particular VOC was measured and had a criteria on one of these particular lists, then we took the lowest value that was available from those three lists and made it our criteria. So in this particular table, we have the maximum allowable emission rate for each chemical that fell on any of these particular lists in the actual emission rate based on the office model. So, next slide. I guess that's the last slide. So those were the criteria, the particle criteria and the VOC criteria to which printer filament combinations can be compared against. So that's what we have for you today, and we appreciate your participation and interest in our topic.
Thank you so much. There was a lot of information, a lot of good information there. I'm going to take the chance to put one question out there before we get started on seeing what was in our chat box. I know that the 3D printers are really big, especially in high schools and places like that. They're very popular. They're not being used with any kind of, most cases, just sitting in the back of a room or sitting somewhere like that. Where do either of you, what are your thoughts on that and the protectiveness or the ways that we should be looking in our schools or giving guidance towards doing something different for this technology, which is very useful in STEM programs and other things, but may be causing hazards for our kids and their teachers?
Okay, well, that's a great question, Laureen, and we have been in a number of schools and observed the use of these 3D printers. I mean, they are very common in elementary schools as well as high schools and colleges, and often sitting in a classroom or in a closet. Sometimes they have little maker centers they've set up where they have multiple machines along with other things that kids come in and do their special projects with. So I think there is a concern from the school standpoint. And one of our objectives from the UL perspective is to develop a program to help communicate this information and some guidance on how to minimize the emissions by having control mechanisms in place. So we do have a next level of research that we're continuing. Part of that research is developing additional toxicity data on the particles that Rodney covered. Another part of it is looking at some of the newer technologies that have metals associated with it so that we can look at potential lead exposure and things like that. And the third part of it is actually to go into some schools and gather some real-time data so that we can look at it relative to the situation in the environment in the school and also to the lab data that we've collected. But I think there's going to have to be a lot of education and guidance out to the schools to get them to focus on this and think about especially providing additional ventilation or local ventilation, exhaust or something.
Okay, I'll hand it over to Christina to see if there are questions in our chat room.
Thank you, Lorraine. We have a few questions that have come in. The first question comes from Rebecca, and Rebecca asks, is it intended that this standard will be used for printing methods other than fused deposition modeling?
I think the answer to that is yes, and we are continuing to look at some of the other technologies that are small enough and more compact so that they can be tested in an actual laboratory setting for this particular standard. And so as we look at those additional technologies, then we will, assess the applicability of the test method and then make recommendations as we go forward on updates to the standard.
Thank you. We have another question, this time from Marion. She asks, will the UL standard now be used for enforcement? What entities do you see acting as enforcement rights? I can see potential enforcement in schools and offices, but not in homes. A man's home is his castle mentality exists in our state.
Well, I would imagine, since this is the indoor air environment overall, that potentially the market may drive some conformity to this particular standard and future standards as they develop. We do know that the marketplace is asking a lot of questions of the manufacturers of these printers as well as the print media, and I think they are anxious to qualify their products to some level of minimization of emissions, and will be anxious to get that information in the marketplace. So I think it will be a voluntary type of program that will get adopted.
Thank you. We have another question, this one from Brett. Are you using the assessment approach of the HEBB or just the chemical exposure threshold? I ask because I understand, which may not be correct, that the HEBB included a consideration of cumulative impacts from multiple chemicals, i.e. by adding the relative concentrations of each chemical emitted compared to the standard. Does your assessment consider any cumulative impacts from multiple chemicals?
No, currently it doesn't. And I know the HEBB folks, the EU folks, are looking at that, but I didn't think anything was available on actually doing it yet.
We have another question. For this one from Todd. For the linear regression between particle number and printed mass, are the values used for particle number a total number produced, or is it for a specific time period?
That was the scatter graph. Yes, so each data point was the total number emitted for printing an object of a given mass. So it's not the emissions during the printing process or the emission rate at a given time, it was the total emissions for a given particle. So the idea was that if you look at the slope of the line, you get the total emission per mass of object. When we actually run the experiment, when we actually do all these experiments, we don't do multiple prints with different object masses to make a graph like that. We just do one print with a given mass object or different given shape and take the ratio of the total number particles emitted per mass of object printed. But the point is, from that graph, is that it basically gives you the same number if you take the ratio or if you do multiple runs with different mass objects and take the slope.
Thank you. I'd like to encourage the audience to submit their questions using the question function. We have another question. The following is, I'm interested in purchasing a 3D printer, but I'm concerned about the ventilation in my shared apartment building. What do you recommend for multifamily residents and home residents in general?
Well, we recommend that you put it in an environment where you can have as much ventilation as possible. So, you know, if you can operate it in an area where you can open a window, you know, and possibly have some outlet available, that would be great. You know, if you could have a fan blowing near it and a window open, that would help a lot. But you know, there is some concern in the environment where you have a standard ventilation system, and I'm not sure you I would be concerned about those emissions going up into an HVAC system that gets distributed throughout a, additional locations within the floor of a multi-use building.
Okay, Christina, do we have any, one additional last question?
Can I make a comment? This is Rodney.
Yes, please.
I would also say some of the point of looking at least the aerosol emissions is to be careful on where you buy your filament or print material from. So, for example, it's really clear that PLA orders less aerosol than ABS. Now, PLA may not produce a product that has got the same qualities as an ABS printed part, but PLA tends to produce, we know from across all the measurements we did of various filaments, is that PLA is generally the lowest. But you still can have, as I was saying, variability within even a certain compound that you're printing. And so if you buy, I think you're better off buying a filament from possibly the manufacturers of printers, because they are more likely, I think, to produce high-quality filaments versus just buying a filament off the web that you don't really know the manufacturer of. And that's where we see these where you can have filaments that have surprisingly much higher concentrations than the average for that type of filament material.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. This one from Jack. What feedback have you received from the industry, such as industry response, on the UL standard for 2891 indoor air quality for building interiors?
Okay, well, 2891, you're not talking about the 3D print standard, you're talking about another standard for materials?
I think I had asked a follow-up question. I think what he was referring to, he was mentioning that as one of the other standards that's out there. And have you heard any feedback or response from the industry with the publishing of this standard?
Okay. Well, the industry was very much involved as a stakeholder through our research initiatives as well as the standard development process. So majority of the industry has been very supportive and concerned about this particular issue and wanted to address it. So I think the feedback is good.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Marion. If you were to use something like a canopy hood or slot diffuser, would it cool the nozzle too much?
This is Rodney. I'm not really sure what a canopy hood is. Are you talking about essentially, these printers, you can buy some printers that are totally enclosed versus some printers that are not enclosed. And some enclosed printers have internal fans circulating the air through a HEPA filter, which does work a little bit at reducing particles, but not much. Many of these printers have a fan right by the nozzle so that keeps the parts around it cool, and that affects the emissions a little bit, mainly more the evolution of the emission during the printing process, but not the total number. I'm not really sure what you mean by a canopy. You mean like a larger space? Like enclosing the printer in a larger space and then ventilating that enclosure or something? That should not have really an effect on how the printer works. All the action for the formation is right near the nozzle, very close to the nozzle. And then after that, it just gets dispersed and diluted as it moves out into the room.
So a canopy situation could be like a range hood almost over a cooktop, I would imagine.
Sure. Yeah, if you had a range hood, that would be a good way, just like it works on the stove, to pull stuff away. And it would not affect the printer, I don't think, too much, particularly if you had an enclosed printer. In fact, I don't think it would have any effect at all on the printing, probably. It might cool the part down quicker and might have warping issues or something, but I doubt it.
Thank you. That's all the questions that we have currently.
Thank you. And there was one last question from the room here. With the production of the new standard, would there be expecting to see some type of labeling or something on the product itself that would allow customers to know that it has been tested under this new standard?
I believe that is the anticipation. The ANSI standard is out there for any certification, verification organization to use. I know that there have been some that have expressed interest in providing that sort of third-party verification, so I would expect that we will begin to see that in the marketplace.
Hey, thank you so much, Rodney and Marilyn. This has been very educational and very interesting. I look forward to seeing where the rest of the research goes in the future. We want to thank everyone for joining us for today's meeting. Again, all materials, including the presentation and the summaries, will be available on the CIAQ website within a few weeks after this meeting. Our next CIAQ meeting is scheduled for June the 5th. We hope to see all of you there, and we thank you very much for your participation. We'll now close this CIAQ meeting.